There are people who stop one day, not because they gave up, not because they got tired in the ordinary way. They stop because they finally understood something most people will spend their whole lives running from, something ugly and simple and almost impossible to explain to someone who has not yet stood at the bottom of a very long fall and looked up without screaming. They stop chasing people the way a man stops chasing buses in a city he no longer wants to be in. They let the bus go. They stand still on the sidewalk. And somehow, in that stillness, something inside them begins to breathe again for the first time in years. You have probably known someone like this. Maybe you are this person, and you are still trying to understand what happened to you, why you woke up one morning and realized that the hunger was gone, that the anxious checking of your phone felt like touching a wound you were finally done reopening. Or maybe you are still deep inside the chase, still texting first, still rearranging your entire personality to fit into someone else's comfort, still making yourself smaller and quieter and more convenient, waiting for a gratitude that never comes with any real warmth. Either way, you are here, and that means something already reached you before this video even started. Charles Bukowski never wrote self-help. He would have hated the genre with a specific and articulate contempt, but buried inside his poems, his short stories, his novels written in cheap rooms with bad wine and a cigarette burning down to nothing, is one of the clearest maps ever drawn of why certain people stop needing approval from others, stop begging for love, stop performing for an audience that was never really watching them with any genuine interest anyway. Bukowski lived at the edge of ordinary society, not because he was romantic about poverty or isolation, but because he came to understand something about the cost of belonging, about what it actually takes from you to stay wanted, to stay tolerated, to stay safe inside the approval of people who are themselves terrified of being alone. He paid attention to that cost in a way most people cannot afford to. Here is the thing nobody tells you about people who stop chasing others. It is not that they became cold. It is not that something broke inside them and left them hollow. It is that something finally settled into its correct position, like a bone that had been out of joint for so long that the pain had become background noise. And then one day, quietly, it found its place again. And the relief of that settling is so profound and so private that it almost cannot be spoken about without cheapening it. Bukowski understood this. He wrote about it sideways, through the lens of the racetrack, through the alcoholic haze of a Tuesday afternoon, through the face of a woman leaving, through the silence of a room where nobody was coming and nobody needed to come for anything to be all right. What he saw, what he kept returning to in his work with that relentless, grinding honesty he had, was this. Most human suffering around relationships comes not from love itself, but from the performance of needing to be chosen, from the exhausting and often invisible labor of making yourself acceptable to people who would not recognize your actual self if it sat across from them at the same table for a year. He wrote about men and women spending their entire lives in that performance, dressing the wound of their own self-doubt with the temporary bandage of someone else's attention, and then wondering why they felt hollow even when they were surrounded by people, even when the phone was full of messages, even when someone was lying next to them in the dark. Think about the last time you contorted yourself to keep someone interested. Maybe you laughed at something that wasn't funny to you. Maybe you stayed quiet about something that mattered to you because you could sense, with that particular animal intelligence people develop when they are afraid of being left, that your truth would make the other person uncomfortable, and you needed their comfort more than you needed your own honesty. Maybe you drove to a place you did not want to be, talked about things that meant nothing to you, waited for a text back with the specific kind of desperation that disguises itself as casual interest. That contortion, that slow folding of yourself into a more palatable shape, that is what Bukowski was writing about when he wrote about the men who drank too much and the women who disappeared, and the city that kept grinding forward indifferently while everyone inside it tried to convince themselves they were living. If you have ever felt that exhaustion, that particular weariness, that is not about sleep, but about having spent years running after something that keeps moving just slightly out of reach. Leave a comment below that says only this: I am done shrinking. You do not need to explain anything else, just those words. Because somewhere in this comment section, someone else who has spent years making themselves smaller for people who never asked them to grow is going to read those words, and they are going to feel less alone than they have felt in a very long time. That matters. That is not nothing. Bukowski stopped chasing people early, and he stopped hard. He was rejected by almost every publisher in America for years. He worked a post office job for over a decade that would have crushed the dignity out of most people who consider themselves artists. He drank. He lived in rooms that were not rooms so much as holding areas between one bad situation and the next. And in all of that, he kept writing, not because he believed the writing would be rewarded, not because he was performing for an imagined future audience, but because the writing itself was the only activity in his life that did not require him to be something other than what he actually was. That is the secret buried inside all of his work. The thing that made him Bukowski was not the drinking or the brutality or the outsider mythology. It was that he had found, through a combination of failure and stubbornness and a very specific kind of grief, the ability to be completely himself in the act of creating, without needing anyone to validate that selfhood in order for it to be real. People who stop chasing others have usually arrived at a version of that same understanding, though almost never through the same path. They have usually been hurt in a specific way, not a dramatic way, not the kind of way that makes for a good story at a party, but in the quiet and accumulating way that comes from years of giving themselves away in increments too small to notice until the total is enormous. They gave attention and did not receive it back in equal measure. They gave patience and had it confused with weakness. They gave honesty and watched it be used against them in arguments months later. And at some point, not in a single decisive moment, but in a slow and almost imperceptible turning, they began to understand that the problem was not the specific people who had failed them. The problem was the entire orientation, the posture of chasing, the fundamental belief that their worth was something that lived inside other people's estimation of them rather than inside themselves. Bukowski wrote a line that gets quoted often but understood rarely. He wrote that the free soul is rare, but you know it when you see it, because mostly it has a look of ease and it walks differently. What he meant by that, if you read everything around it, if you sit with his work long enough to hear the frequency beneath the surface, is that freedom from the need to be chosen does not look like arrogance, and it does not look like indifference. It looks like ease. It looks like someone who has stopped spending energy on the maintenance of an image and redirected that energy into something that is actually theirs. The walk is different because the weight is different, the weight of performance, of constant self-monitoring, of the ongoing calculation of how one is being perceived, is a weight so habitual that most people do not even know they are carrying it until they set it down, and then the lightness is almost disorienting. This is the psychology that nobody fully maps, because the people who have completed this transition rarely want to explain it. They are too busy living inside it. But Bukowski mapped it in the ugly, specific detail that was his particular genius. He mapped it in the character of a man who had been rejected so many times that rejection lost its power to define him. He mapped it in the image of a person sitting alone in a room with a bottle and a typewriter, and no audience, and no expectation of an audience, and producing something true anyway. He mapped it in the recurring figure across his work of someone who simply refuses, not dramatically, not with a speech, not with a final confrontation, but with a quiet and total withdrawal of the energy that had been used to perform for others. What changes in a person when they reach this place is not their capacity for love. That is the misunderstanding that people make about those who stop chasing. They assume that withdrawal from the chase means withdrawal from feeling, from connection, from wanting. It does not. What disappears is not the desire for connection, but the desperation that was distorting it. What disappears is the willingness to accept the simulation of connection in place of the real thing, to accept being tolerated in place of being seen, to accept presence that is physically close but emotionally absent. The person who stops chasing does not want less. They want something different, something truer, and they have developed, usually at considerable cost, the patience to wait for it or the peace to do without it if it does not come. That is not coldness. That is a very specific and hard-won form of self-respect. Bukowski called it differently at different points in his life, but the core of it was always the same. He called it knowing what you are, not in the triumphant motivational sense, in the factual, unsentimental sense of having looked at yourself without flattery and without brutality and arrived at some accurate account of what is actually there. When you know what you are, you stop needing other people to tell you. And when you stop needing other people to tell you, the entire architecture of chasing begins to lose its structural logic. Why would you run after someone to receive from them a definition of yourself that you already possess? If there is one thing that Bukowski's work gives you, beyond the pleasure of the language and the dark comedy and the specific poetry of ordinary degradation, it is permission. Permission to be exactly what you are without apology and without performance. Permission to sit in a room alone and find that sufficient. Permission to love without groveling. To want, without begging. To walk away from what diminishes you without constructing a narrative that makes the walking away heroic. It is not heroic. It is just accurate. It is just what you do when you finally understand that your energy is finite and that spending it on people who do not see you is a form of theft that you have been complicit in, and that the complicity ends when you decide it ends quietly, without announcement, the way Bukowski ended most of his poems, not with a conclusion, but with a door closing. If something in this video moved something in you, give it a like, not as a favor. Not as a reflex. Give it because you want someone else who has been running themselves into the ground chasing people who were never really looking back to find this conversation and feel what you felt when you heard it. The algorithm responds to that, and the algorithm is, for all its indifference, one of the few mechanisms we have for getting one specific piece of honesty in front of the specific person who needs it tonight. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, consider it. Not because you owe it, not because it costs you anything difficult, but because this channel exists for the person who is tired of the performance, who wants to think carefully and honestly about what it means to live in this particular world with this particular kind of interior life. Every video here is made for that person. Every video is an attempt to say, in the clearest terms available, that the examined life is still worth living, that the margin is still a place where real things happen, and that Bukowski, drunk and difficult and absolutely uncompromising, was pointing at something essential that most of the polished world is still trying very hard to look away from.